You have brilliant ideas locked inside your mind, but when it's time to speak up in meetings, your voice catches and your thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. Every opportunity to share your insights becomes a missed chance for recognition, while you watch less knowledgeable colleagues command attention with their confident voices. I am Dale Carnegie, and I transformed from a terrified farm boy who couldn't speak 2 words without stammering into the man who taught millions to find their voice and influence others. What I discovered about speaking with confidence will transform how you present yourself in every conversation, meeting, and presentation, giving you the power to turn your ideas into influence and your voice into your greatest asset. The same principles that helped me overcome crippling shyness and build a global empire of communication can work for anyone willing to push past their comfort zone. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing communication wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to find their voice and speak with unshakable confidence. I was born Dale Carnegie on November 24, 1888, in Maryville, Missouri, on a farm that seemed to stretch endlessly under the vast prairie sky. My father, James William Carnegie, was a man of few words but strong opinions, and my mother, Amanda Elizabeth Harbison Carnegie, possessed a gentle spirit that would later become my anchor during the storms of self-doubt. From my earliest memories, words were my enemy. While other children chatted freely, I stumbled over syllables like a man walking through thick mud. My tongue felt heavy and uncooperative, betraying me at the worst possible moments. When visitors came to our farm, I would hide behind my mother's skirts, terrified that someone might ask me a direct question. The shame burned in my chest like a hot coal. School was my daily torment. When called upon to recite, my face would flush red as a summer tomato, and the words would stick in my throat like burrs on wool. I remember one particularly humiliating day when I was asked to stand and read a passage from our McGuffey reader. The words swam before my eyes, and what came out of my mouth was barely recognizable as English. The other children snickered, and I felt so small I wished I could disappear into the wooden floorboards beneath my feet at home. My stammering grew worse whenever my father was present. He had no patience for what he saw as weakness, and his stern glances made my tongue tie itself in knots. During family dinners, I learned to communicate through nods and gestures, speaking only when absolutely necessary. I became a master of silence, but inside, my mind was bursting with thoughts and ideas that had no outlet. The isolation was crushing. I watched other boys my age form friendships through easy conversation, while I remained on the outside, locked in my prison of inarticulation. I began to believe that I was fundamentally flawed, that confident speech was a gift reserved for others. This belief followed me like a shadow, darkening even my brightest moments. When I reached high school age, my parents decided to send me to Warrensburg State Normal School. The prospect terrified me. A new place meant new people who would witness my shameful inability to speak properly, but it also represented something else, a chance to reinvent myself away from the knowing looks and lowered expectations of my hometown. On that September morning when I left for Warrensburg, I carried with me not just a battered suitcase and my mother's prayers, but also a secret determination. Deep in my heart, despite all evidence to the contrary, I harbored a tiny flame of hope that somehow, someday, I might find my voice. I had no idea that this journey would transform not just my ability to speak, but my entire understanding of human potential. Asterisk. At Warrensburg State Normal School, I discovered something that would revolutionize my understanding of human nature and communication forever. It happened during my first week, as I sat in the back of a literature class, trying to make myself invisible as usual. The professor, Dr. Overstreet, announced that each student would be required to give a 5-minute presentation on their chosen Career path, my heart sank like a stone in deep water. Here, it was my worst nightmare realized. I considered dropping the class, maybe even leaving school altogether. But as I looked around the room at my fellow students, I noticed something remarkable. The confident-looking young man beside me was fidgeting with his pencil, his leg bouncing nervously under his desk. The well-dressed girl in the front row was chewing her fingernails down to the quick. Even the most articulate students showed signs of anxiety when faced with the prospect of speaking publicly. That's when it hit me like lightning on a clear day. Everyone was afraid. The fear that had paralyzed me my entire life wasn't unique to me. It was the universal human condition. This revelation shook me to my core, because it meant that if others could overcome their fear and speak confidently, then perhaps I could too. I began to observe my classmates more carefully during their presentations. Those who seemed most confident often made mistakes, stumbled over words, or forgot their points entirely. Yet they continued speaking, recovered gracefully, and somehow maintained their composure. I realized that confidence wasn't the absence of fear, it was the mastery of fear. The night before my presentation, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small dormitory room, rehearsing my speech about becoming a teacher. But something had changed in my mindset. Instead of focusing on my inevitable failure, I found myself genuinely excited about sharing my passion for education with my classmates. When my turn came, I stood before the class with trembling hands and a racing heart, but I also stood with something new purpose. I began to speak about my dream of helping rural children receive quality education. And as I spoke, something magical happened. My stammer diminished, my voice grew stronger, and I felt a connection with my audience that I had never experienced before. I wasn't perfect that day. I still stumbled over some words, and my hands shook slightly. But I completed my presentation, and when I sat down, I felt transformed. For the first time in my life, I had successfully communicated my thoughts and feelings to a group of people. The impossible had become possible, and if it could happen once, it could happen again. That evening, I received a letter from my mother that seemed to arrive at the perfect moment. She wrote about her pride in my courage to pursue education and reminded me that our family had never been afraid of hard work. Her words gave me the final push I needed to understand that conquering my fear of speaking would require the same determination I had applied to farm work and studies. From that day forward, I began to see speaking not as a talent reserved for the gifted few, but as a skill that could be developed through practice, preparation, and persistence. This revelation would become the foundation of everything I would later teach about human communication and personal development. Asterisk. After my breakthrough presentation, I threw myself into speaking opportunities with the fervor of a man possessed. But I quickly learned a hard lesson that would reshape my understanding of skill development forever. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. If you practice incorrectly, you permanently embed bad habits that become increasingly difficult to break. My first attempts at deliberate speaking practice were disasters. I would stand in front of my dormitory mirror, gesticulating wildly and speaking on random topics that came to mind. I thought volume and enthusiasm could compensate for lack of structure and purpose. I was wrong. These sessions reinforced my tendency to ramble, to use filler words, and to rely on dramatic gestures rather than clear communication. The turning point came when I volunteered to speak at a local farmer's meeting about corn cultivation techniques. I chose this topic because I knew it intimately from my years on the farm. I assumed my knowledge would naturally translate into confident delivery. Again, I was mistaken. Standing before those weathered farmers, I realized that knowing your subject and communicating it effectively were entirely different skills. I knew everything about corn planting, soil preparation, and harvest timing, but I struggled to organize this knowledge in a way that was engaging and useful to my audience. I jumped from topic to topic, repeated myself, and failed to provide the clear, actionable advice these hard-working men deserved. But something remarkable happened during that awkward presentation. As I talked about the specific challenges of Missouri soil conditions, I noticed several farmers nodding in recognition. When I described a particular pest problem that had plagued our farm the previous season, I saw genuine interest in their eyes. Despite my poor delivery, the content was resonating because it came from real experience and addressed their actual concerns. This experience taught me the first principle of effective practice: always begin with genuine knowledge and sincere desire to help your audience. Without these foundations, no amount of technique or polish can create truly powerful communication. I began to approach practice differently. Instead of random topics, I focused on subjects where I had real knowledge and genuine passion. Instead of practicing in isolation, I sought out small, supportive audiences where I could test my ideas and refine my delivery. I joined the college literary society, volunteered for community events, and even offered to give talks at local churches. Each speaking opportunity became a laboratory for improvement. I learned to pay attention not just to what I said, but how I said it, how my audience responded, and what elements of my presentation created the strongest connection. I started keeping detailed notes after each speaking experience, recording what worked, what didn't, and what I wanted to try differently next time. Most importantly, I discovered that effective practice required a specific type of repetition. Instead of mindlessly rehearsing the same speech the same way, I practiced individual elements of speaking: clear articulation, logical organization, engaging openings, powerful conclusions, and smooth transitions between ideas. I treated speaking like a craft with specific skills that could be isolated, practiced, and gradually integrated into a cohesive whole. This systematic approach to practice transformed my speaking abilities far more rapidly than my earlier haphazard efforts. I began to understand that confidence comes not from the absence of mistakes, but from the knowledge that you have prepared thoroughly and possess the skills to handle whatever challenges arise during your presentation. The farmers' meeting had taught me that authentic expertise, combined with systematic practice, creates the foundation for truly confident communication. This insight would guide my development as a speaker and later inform my teaching methods for helping others overcome their own communication challenges. Asterisk. The most profound lesson I learned about confident speaking came not during a successful presentation, but during a spectacular failure that could have ended my speaking aspirations forever. It was the spring of 1908, and I had been invited to address the annual Warrensburg Chamber of Commerce dinner, the most prestigious speaking opportunity I had ever received. I was overconfident. My recent successes at smaller venues had inflated my ego, and I believed that my natural enthusiasm and growing comfort with audiences would carry me through. I prepared casually, jotting down a few key points on the back of an envelope the night before the event. I told myself that spontaneity would make my presentation more authentic and engaging. I was catastrophically wrong. When I stood before those business leaders, community pillars, and distinguished guests, my mind went completely blank. The few notes I had scribbled were illegible under the dining room lights, and without a clear structure to guide me, I floundered helplessly. I repeated myself, contradicted my own points, and watched as polite attention turned to uncomfortable fidgeting. After what felt like an eternity, I mumbled a hasty conclusion and sat down to sparse obligatory applause that the humiliation was crushing. But it became the catalyst for developing what would become my systematic approach to preparation, a method that would eventually help millions of people speak with confidence. That night, alone in my room, I began developing what I called my preparation framework. I realized that confidence flows directly from thorough preparation, and thorough preparation requires a systematic approach that leaves nothing to chance. My framework began with purpose. Before preparing any speech, I learned to ask myself three fundamental questions. What specific outcome do I want to achieve? What does my audience need to know or feel to reach that outcome? What obstacles might prevent me from achieving this? Purpose. These questions became the foundation upon which every successful presentation was built. Next came research and organization. I developed a habit of gathering far more material than I could possibly use, then ruthlessly selecting only the most relevant and compelling points. I learned to organize my content in logical sequences that would be easy for audiences to follow and remember. I created detailed outlines that served as roadmaps through my presentations, ensuring I would never again lose my way in front of an audience. But preparation went beyond content. I began rehearsing not just my words, but my entire presentation experience. I practiced my opening lines until they became automatic, eliminating the anxiety of those crucial first moments when nerves are highest. I rehearsed transitions between major points, ensuring smooth flow throughout my presentation. I even prepared responses to potential questions and challenges, building confidence in my ability to handle unexpected situations. Physical preparation became equally important. I learned to visit speaking venues in advance when possible, familiarizing myself with the room layout, acoustics, and sightlines. I practiced projecting my voice to reach the back row, and I developed pre-speaking routines that helped me manage nervousness and center my focus. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to prepare emotionally and mentally. Before every speaking engagement, I spent time connecting with my genuine desire to serve my audience. I reminded myself of the value I could provide and the positive impact my message could have on listeners' lives. This emotional preparation transformed speaking from a test of my abilities into an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to others. The transformation was remarkable. As my preparation became more thorough and systematic, my confidence grew exponentially. I no longer feared unexpected questions because I had anticipated them. I no longer worried about forgetting key points because my organizational system made my content memorable and logical. I no longer anxiously wondered if my message would resonate because I had crafted it specifically for my audience's needs and interests. The Chamber of Commerce invited me back the following year. This time, I spent weeks preparing. I researched the economic challenges facing our community, interviewed local business leaders to understand their concerns, and crafted a presentation that addressed their specific needs with practical solutions. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and that evening marked my transformation from an occasionally successful speaker to someone who could consistently deliver value to any audience. Through this experience, I discovered that preparation is not just about avoiding failure, it's about creating the conditions for genuine connection and meaningful impact. When you prepare thoroughly, you free yourself to focus entirely on serving your audience rather than worrying about your own performance. Asterisk. After my preparation revelation, I developed what I came to call the stepping stone strategy, a deliberate approach to building speaking confidence through carefully chosen, progressively challenging opportunities. I had learned that jumping from small successes to major speaking engagements without proper progression was a recipe for disaster. True confidence comes from a series of small victories that build upon each other like stones in a foundation. My first stepping stone was the Warrensburg YMCA Speaking Club. This small group of 8 men met every Tuesday evening in a cramped room above Murphy's General Store. The atmosphere was supportive, almost familial, and mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than failures. Here, I could experiment with new techniques, test different approaches, and receive honest feedback without the pressure of formal evaluation. I remember my first presentation to this group about the benefits of crop rotation. It was a simple topic, one I knew intimately, but I used it to practice a new organizational structure I had developed. The men listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and offered constructive suggestions for improvement. That evening, I felt something I had never experienced before: the joy of teaching, of sharing knowledge that genuinely helped others. Each week, I challenged myself with slightly more complex topics and longer presentations. I spoke about local politics, educational reform, and farming innovations. With each talk, my comfort level increased, and more importantly, my understanding of audience dynamics deepened. I learned to read facial expressions, to adjust my pace based on audience engagement, and to recognize when I was losing people's attention. The speaking club became my laboratory for developing what would later become fundamental principles of effective communication. I experimented with humor and discovered that genuine, self-deprecating stories connected better than forced jokes. I tested different opening techniques and found that starting with a relatable problem or intriguing question immediately engaged listeners. I practiced various conclusion methods and learned that ending with a clear call to action left audiences feeling energized and motivated. As my confidence grew within this supportive environment, I began seeking slightly larger challenges, volunteered to speak at church suppers, addressing congregations of 30 to 40 people. These audiences were still friendly and forgiving, but they required me to project my voice more effectively and maintain energy over longer presentations. Next came civic organizations, the Rotary Club, the Chamber of Commerce, auxiliary groups, and local professional associations. These venues demanded more polished presentations and deeper subject matter expertise. I spent considerable time researching topics that would benefit business leaders and community organizers, learning to tailor my content to specific audience needs and interests. Each level of challenge taught me something new about confident speaking. Small groups required intimacy and personal connection. Medium-sized audiences demanded clear structure and vocal projection. Formal organizations expected expertise and practical value. By gradually progressing through these different environments, I developed versatility and adaptability that would serve me throughout my career. The breakthrough moment came when I was invited to address the Missouri State Teachers Association annual conference, an audience of over 300 educators from across the state. 6 months earlier, this opportunity would have terrified me into decline. But having built my confidence through dozens of smaller successes, I accepted with excitement rather than dread. My presentation on practical methods for rural education was a triumph. I spoke for 45 minutes without notes, engaging the audience with stories from my own teaching experience and practical strategies they could immediately implement. The response was enthusiastic, and several attendees approached me afterward to discuss speaking at their own districts and organizations. That evening marked my transition from someone who could speak competently in small, supportive settings to someone who could confidently address large, diverse audiences. But this transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of months of deliberate practice in progressively challenging environments. I learned that building speaking confidence is like physical exercise. You don't start by attempting to lift the heaviest weight in the gymnasium. You begin with manageable challenges, gradually increase the difficulty, and allow your strength to develop naturally over time. Each successful speaking experience adds to your confidence reservoir, making the next challenge feel less daunting and more achievable. The stepping stone strategy also taught me the importance of celebrating small victories. Each successful presentation, no matter how modest the venue or audience, deserved recognition and analysis. What had worked well? What could be improved? How could this success be built upon for future opportunities? This reflective practice turned every speaking experience into a learning opportunity that contributed to long-term growth. By starting small and thinking big, I discovered that confident speaking isn't a talent you're born with, it's a skill you develop through systematic practice and gradual challenge progression. Anyone willing to begin with small steps and remain committed to continuous improvement can develop the ability to speak confidently before any audience. Asterisk. The most transformative discovery of my speaking journey came during a presentation that almost never happened. It was 1910, and I had been invited to speak at a teachers' meeting in a small farming community outside Kansas City. The topic was supposed to be modern educational methods, but when I arrived, I discovered that the local school was facing closure due to declining enrollment and community apathy. Instead of delivering my prepared presentation, I found myself genuinely curious about the challenges these educators were facing. I asked questions about their specific struggles, listened to their concerns about losing their school, and learned about the families who would be affected by the closure. As I listened, I forgot entirely about my own nervousness and became completely absorbed in their situation. When it came time for my presentation, something remarkable happened. Instead of focusing on my performance, my anxiety, or my desire to impress, I found myself wholly concentrated on how I could help these teachers and their community. I spoke from the heart about practical solutions I had seen work in similar situations. I shared stories of communities that had revitalized their schools through parent engagement and creative programming. I offered specific strategies they could implement immediately. The transformation in my speaking was dramatic. My voice became stronger and more natural because I wasn't thinking about how I sounded. I was thinking about the value I could provide. My gestures became more expressive because they flowed from genuine emotion rather than calculated performance. My words came more easily because they were driven by sincere desire to help rather than fear of judgment. But the most remarkable change was in my relationship with the audience. When I stopped focusing on myself and started focusing on them, a magical connection occurred. I could see understanding dawn in their faces, hope replaced despair in their expressions, and determination spark in their eyes. They weren't judging my speaking ability, they were absorbing ideas that could save their school and their community. That evening taught me what would become the cornerstone principle of confident speaking. Genuine interest in your audience is the most powerful antidote to speaking anxiety. When you're truly focused on serving others, there's no mental space left for self-consciousness or fear. I began applying this principle systematically to every speaking opportunity. Before each presentation, I spent considerable time learning about my audience, their challenges, their goals, their concerns, and their hopes. I asked myself, not how can I impress them, but how can I help them? This shift in focus changed everything about my preparation and delivery. When speaking to business groups, I researched the economic challenges in their industry and region. I spoke with local business owners to understand their specific struggles and opportunities. My presentations became consultations rather than performances, focused on providing practical value rather than demonstrating my expertise. When addressing educational audiences, I investigated the particular challenges facing their schools and students. I shared strategies that had worked in similar contexts and adapted my content to their specific needs and resources. Teachers responded enthusiastically because they felt understood and supported rather than lectured to. The genuine interest principle also transformed how I handled difficult speaking situations. When faced with hostile or skeptical audiences, instead of becoming defensive, I became curious. What concerns were driving their resistance? What experiences had shaped their skepticism? What would it take to address their doubts constructively? I remember speaking to a group of farmers who were initially resistant to new agricultural techniques I was discussing. Instead of pushing harder to convince them, I asked genuine questions about their experiences with similar innovations. I listened carefully to their concerns about cost, practicality, and risk. Then I adjusted my presentation to address their specific worries with concrete examples and practical solutions. By the end of the evening, these initially hostile farmers were asking detailed questions about implementation and requesting follow-up consultations. The transformation occurred not because I became a better persuader, but because I became a better listener and more genuine servant of their needs. This principle extended beyond the content of my presentations to the very atmosphere I created while speaking. When audiences sensed that I was genuinely interested in their welfare rather than my own performance, they became more receptive, more engaged, and more willing to consider new ideas. The speaking dynamic shifted from performance to conversation-with-friends. I learned that genuine interest is something audiences can detect instantly and intuitively. You cannot fake it effectively, and you don't need to announce it explicitly. When your focus is truly on serving your listeners, it shows in your tone, your attention to their responses, your willingness to adapt your message based on their needs, and your authentic emotional investment in their success. The miracle of genuine interest is that it simultaneously makes you a more effective speaker and eliminates the self-consciousness that creates speaking anxiety. When you're absorbed in helping others, you forget to worry about yourself. When you're focused on providing value, you stop fearing judgment. When you're genuinely interested in your audience's welfare, confident speaking becomes not just possible, but inevitable. This discovery revolutionized not only my speaking abilities, but my entire approach to human relationships and communication. The principle that would later become central to my teaching, that sincere interest in others is the foundation of all effective human interaction, was born from those moments when I learned to step outside myself and into genuine service of my audiences. Despite my growing success as a speaker, I battled an internal enemy that threatened to undermine every achievement. The relentless voice of self-criticism that whispered doubts and magnified every imperfection. This inner critic was more destructive than any hostile audience because it attacked from within, where I had no defense except the strength of my own mind. The inner critic had been my constant companion since childhood. It was the voice that told me I was fundamentally flawed, that my success was temporary luck, and that eventual failure was inevitable. After every speaking engagement, regardless of how well it had gone, this voice would catalogue my mistakes, question my competence, and predict future disasters. I remember a particularly successful presentation to the Missouri Education Association, where I received a standing ovation and numerous compliments. But as I walked back to my hotel that evening, the inner critic was already at work. You stumbled over that word in the third paragraph. Several people in the back row looked bored during your second story. That joke fell flat with the women in the audience. You were lucky tonight, but next time you won't be so fortunate. This pattern of self-sabotage was destroying my confidence faster than external success could build it. I realized that unless I learned to manage this internal dialogue, I would never achieve the lasting confidence I sought. I needed to understand the nature of this voice and develop strategies to neutralize its destructive power. Through careful self-observation, I discovered that the inner critic operated according to predictable patterns. It was strongest when I was tired, stressed, or facing new challenges. It fed on perfectionism, magnifying minor mistakes into major failures. It thrived on comparisons, constantly measuring my performance against idealized standards that no human could meet consistently. Most insidiously, the inner critic disguised itself as helpful preparation, claiming to protect me from failure by anticipating every possible problem, but I learned to distinguish between productive preparation and destructive worry. Productive preparation focused on specific actions I could take to improve my performance. Destructive worry ruminated on potential failures without offering concrete solutions. I began developing what I called my mental defense system, set of practices designed to weaken the inner critic's influence and strengthen my psychological resilience. The first element was awareness. I learned to recognize the critic's voice and distinguish it from legitimate self-reflection. When I caught myself engaging in harsh self-judgment, I would pause and ask, is this observation helping me improve, or is it simply tearing me down? The second element was evidence-based thinking. Instead of accepting the critic's negative assessments automatically, I began demanding proof. If the voice claimed I was a terrible speaker, I would review specific evidence, positive feedback from audiences, successful outcomes from my presentations, concrete improvements in my skills over time. This practice helped me develop a more balanced and realistic self-assessment. I also learned to reframe criticism constructively. Instead of "I'm terrible at transitions between topics," I would think I can improve my transitions between topics by practicing specific bridging phrases. Instead of "I'll never be as good as professional speakers," I would think I can continue developing my skills through consistent practice and learning. Perhaps most importantly, I developed what I called compassionate self-talk, treating myself with the same kindness I would show a good friend facing similar challenges. When I made mistakes during presentations, instead of harsh self-condemnation, I would acknowledge the error and focus on learning from it. I reminded myself that mistakes were not character flaws, but natural parts of the learning process. I began keeping a success journal where I recorded positive feedback, successful outcomes, and moments of personal growth. When the inner critic attacked, I could refer to concrete evidence of my progress and competence. This practice helped me build a reservoir of confidence that could withstand temporary setbacks and self-doubt. Another powerful technique was visualization combined with positive affirmation. Before each speaking engagement, I would spend time mentally rehearsing not just my presentation, but also my response to potential challenges. I would visualize myself handling difficult questions gracefully, recovering from minor mistakes smoothly, and connecting authentically with my audience. This mental preparation created confidence and reduced the unknown factors that fed my anxiety. I also learned the importance of self-forgiveness. The inner critic thrived on past mistakes, using them as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. I developed the ability to acknowledge past errors without allowing them to define my future potential. I reminded myself that every accomplished speaker had made countless mistakes during their development, and that these mistakes were stepping stones rather than tombstones. The breakthrough came during a challenging presentation to a group of skeptical business leaders. Midway through my talk, I completely lost my train of thought and stood silent for what felt like an eternity. In the past, this would have triggered a cascade of self-criticism that would have ruined the remainder of my presentation. Instead, I applied my mental defense strategies. I acknowledged the moment with gentle humor, took a deep breath, and calmly found my way back to my main points. Rather than spiraling into self-condemnation, I maintained my focus on serving my audience. The presentation concluded successfully, and several attendees complimented me on my poise under pressure. That evening, the inner critic tried to attack. "You made a fool of yourself up there." But I was ready with evidence-based responses. I handled an unexpected challenge gracefully. The audience appreciated my authenticity. I achieved my presentation objectives despite a minor setback. The critic's voice lost its power because I had learned to counter it with facts rather than fears. Over time, I discovered that conquering the inner critic wasn't about silencing it completely. That voice represented a part of me that wanted to excel and avoid pain. Instead, I learned to transform it from a destructive force into a constructive advisor that helped me prepare thoroughly while maintaining confidence in my abilities. This internal transformation was as important as any external speaking skill I developed. Learning to manage my self-talk, treat myself with compassion, and maintain balanced self-assessment became the foundation for lasting confidence that could withstand any external challenge or temporary setback. One of the most liberating discoveries in my speaking journey was learning that authenticity trumps perfection every time. For years, I had tried to mold myself into what I thought a proper speaker should be: formal, polished, and flawlessly articulate. But this pursuit of artificial perfection was actually preventing me from connecting genuinely with my audiences and expressing my true voice. The revelation came during a speaking engagement at a rural teachers' conference where everything went wrong. I had prepared meticulously, crafting what I believed was a sophisticated presentation on modern educational theory. I had practiced precise pronunciation, formal gestures, and academic language that I thought would impress these educators. But from the moment I began speaking, I could sense the disconnect. My carefully chosen words felt stilted and unnatural. My rehearsed gestures appeared mechanical and forced. The audience sat politely, but their eyes glazed over as I delivered what amounted to a lecture rather than a conversation. I was performing a role rather than sharing genuine insights. Halfway through my presentation, a simple question from a tired-looking teacher about dealing with unruly students broke through my artificial facade. Without thinking, I abandoned my formal approach and began telling a story from my own teaching experience, complete with my natural speech patterns, spontaneous gestures, and the kind of honest frustration and humor that real teachers understand. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, these educators were leaning forward, nodding in recognition, and smiling at the shared experiences I was describing. When I finished the impromptu story and tried to return to my prepared remarks, several hands shot up with questions and comments. They wanted more of the real me, not the artificial speaker I had been trying to become. That evening taught me that audiences crave authenticity above all else. They want to connect with a real person who understands their challenges, shares their concerns, and speaks to them as equals rather than as inferiors to be impressed. When I tried to be perfect, I became distant and unreachable. When I embraced my imperfections and spoke from genuine experience, I became relatable and trustworthy. I began experimenting with bringing more of my authentic self into my presentations. Instead of hiding my rural background, I embraced it, using farming analogies and small-town examples that resonated with many of my audiences. Instead of trying to eliminate my natural speech patterns, I refined them while maintaining their authenticity. Instead of suppressing my sense of humor, I learned to use it appropriately to create connection and illustrate points. This shift toward authenticity required me to become comfortable with vulnerability. I learned to share my own struggles and failures, not as signs of weakness, but as evidence of my humanity and credibility. When speaking about overcoming challenges, I would honestly describe my own difficulties, rather than presenting myself as someone who had always found success easy. I discovered that audiences respond powerfully to speakers who are willing to admit mistakes, acknowledge limitations, and demonstrate that they are still learning and growing. This vulnerability created trust and made my successes more inspiring because they came from someone who had faced real obstacles rather than from someone who claimed natural superiority. Authentic expression also meant learning to trust my own voice and perspective rather than trying to imitate other speakers I admired. I had spent considerable time studying great orators and attempting to copy their techniques. While this study was valuable for learning skills, it became counterproductive when it led me to suppress my own unique strengths and perspectives. I Learn to honor my natural speaking style, more conversational than oratorical, more practical than theoretical, more encouraging than commanding. Instead of trying to become a different type of speaker, I focused on becoming the best version of my authentic self. This meant developing my natural strengths while gradually improving my weaknesses. The process of finding my authentic voice required honest self-assessment and acceptance. I had to acknowledge that I would never be the most eloquent speaker, the most charismatic performer, or the most scholarly presenter. But I could be the most genuine, the most helpful, and the most encouraging version of myself. I also learned that authenticity doesn't mean being unprepared or undisciplined. Instead, it means preparing thoroughly while remaining true to your natural style and personality. It means practicing your delivery while maintaining spontaneity and genuineness. It means developing professional skills without losing personal warmth and relatability. One of the most powerful aspects of authentic expression is its effect on speaking anxiety. When you're trying to be someone else, you carry the double burden of delivering your content and maintaining an artificial persona. When you speak authentically, you can focus entirely on your message because you're not expending energy on pretense. Authenticity also creates resilience in challenging speaking situations. When you encounter unexpected questions, technical difficulties, or hostile audience members, your authentic self can respond naturally and appropriately. When you're performing a role, these challenges can shatter your facade and leave you defenseless. I remember a particularly difficult presentation where an audience member challenged my credentials and questioned my expertise aggressively. In the past, this attack would have rattled me because I was trying to maintain an image of flawless competence. But speaking authentically, I was able to acknowledge his concerns honestly, share relevant personal experience, and redirect the conversation productively. My genuine response diffused the hostility and actually strengthened my credibility with the rest of the audience. The journey toward authentic expression taught me that confidence comes not from hiding your imperfections, but from accepting them, while focusing on your genuine strengths and sincere desire to help others. When you speak authentically, you invite your audience into a real relationship, rather than asking them to admire a performance. This discovery revolutionized not only my speaking but my entire approach to human connection. I learned that people are drawn to authenticity like plants to sunlight, and that the courage to be genuinely yourself is one of the most powerful tools for building trust, creating influence, and making a meaningful impact on others' lives. I learned the power of physical presence in the most humbling way possible by watching myself in a mirror and being horrified by what I saw. It was 1911, and I had been invited to observe my own presentation by watching my reflection in the large mirror that dominated one wall of the hotel conference room where I was speaking. What I discovered that day revolutionized my understanding of communication and confidence. While my words were carefully chosen and my content well organized, my body was telling a completely different story. My shoulders were hunched forward in a defensive posture that suggested insecurity. My hands were clasped rigidly behind my back, creating a barrier between myself and my audience. My feet were planted in one spot as if nailed to the floor, giving the impression of someone frozen by fear rather than someone confidently sharing valuable insights. Most shocking of all was my facial expression. Despite speaking about topics I was passionate about, my face showed tension and anxiety rather than enthusiasm and conviction. My jaw was clenched, my brow furrowed, and my eyes darted nervously rather than making steady contact with individual audience members. I looked like someone who didn't believe his own message. That mirror showed me a truth I had been blind to. Your body speaks before you open your mouth, and it speaks louder than any words you might utter. An audience forms impressions about your confidence, competence, and credibility within seconds of seeing you. Based entirely on your physical presence and demeanor, I began studying the relationship between physical bearing and perceived confidence. With the same intensity I had applied to verbal communication, I observed confident people in various settings: successful businessmen, respected teachers, effective politicians, paying careful attention to how they carried themselves, moved through space, and used their bodies to reinforce their messages. The discoveries were fascinating and immediately applicable. Confident people stood tall with their shoulders back, not in military rigidity but in relaxed alertness that suggested both strength and approachability. They moved with purpose and grace, using the full space available to them rather than confining themselves to small, defensive areas. Their gestures were natural extensions of their thoughts and emotions, rather than scripted performances. I practiced these observations systematically, starting with posture. I learned to stand with my weight evenly distributed, my spine straight, but not stiff, and my shoulders relaxed, but not slumped. This physical adjustment had an immediate psychological effect. Felt more confident, and audiences responded to me as if I were more confident. Hand position and gesturing became my next focus. I discovered that keeping my hands visible and available for natural gesturing created openness and trustworthiness. Hands clasped behind the back suggested hiding something. Hands in pockets appeared casual to the point of disrespect. Hands rigidly at the sides looked uncomfortable and unnatural. But the most powerful discovery was about eye contact. I had always known that looking at your audience was important, but I hadn't understood the specific mechanics of effective eye contact. I learned to focus on individual faces for complete thoughts, rather than scanning constantly across the room. This created the impression of personal conversation, even in large groups, and helped me gauge audience understanding and engagement. Movement became another tool for building confidence and maintaining audience attention. Instead of remaining planted in one location, I learned to move purposefully, to emphasize transitions between ideas, to create variety in visual focus, and to physically connect with different sections of larger audiences. But I also learned that nervous pacing or random wandering was distracting and suggested anxiety rather than confidence. The breakthrough came when I realized that confident body language wasn't something to be put on like a costume. It had to flow naturally from internal confidence and genuine engagement with my audience. When I focused on serving my listeners and sharing valuable content, my body language automatically became more open, animated, and engaging. I practiced a pre-speaking routine that helped align my physical presence with my internal state. Before each presentation, I would spend a few minutes standing tall, breathing deeply, and mentally connecting with my purpose for speaking. I would remind myself that I was there to help my audience, not to impress them with my perfection. This internal preparation naturally translated into more confident physical presence. I also learned to use my body to manage my own emotional state. When I felt nervous energy building, I could channel it into purposeful movement rather than allowing it to manifest as fidgeting or tension. When I felt uncertain about a point, I could use confident posture and gestures to maintain authority while I found my way back to familiar ground. The mirror had also revealed something crucial about facial expression. I practiced speaking with animation and genuine emotion rather than the mask of serious concentration I had been wearing. I learned that appropriate smiles, raised eyebrows for emphasis, and other natural facial expressions helped audiences connect with both my content and my personality. One of the most valuable lessons was learning to read my audience's body language. In return, when people leaned forward, made eye contact, and nodded, I knew I was connecting effectively. When they slumped back, looked away, or appeared restless, I could adjust my delivery, change my approach, or refocus their attention through movement or vocal variety. The transformation in audience response was dramatic. People began commenting, not just on my content, but on my presence and confidence. They mentioned feeling more engaged and inspired. Several people told me that watching me speak made them feel that they too could develop confidence and effectiveness. I realized that confident body language serves multiple purposes. It enhances your credibility with audiences. It reinforces your own internal confidence. And it creates a positive feedback loop where external composure strengthens internal assurance. When you look confident, people treat you as confident, which makes you feel more confident, which improves your performance, which increases genuine confidence. Most importantly, I learned that mastering physical presence isn't about creating an artificial image. It's about allowing your genuine confidence, competence, and care for your audience to express itself naturally through your entire being. When your body, voice, and words all tell the same story of sincere desire to serve your listeners, you create the kind of powerful, authentic presence that truly influences and inspires others. Asterisk. The first time I heard my own voice played back on Thomas Edison's remarkable phonograph machine, I was mortified. It was 1912, and a friend who worked for a recording company had invited me to experience this new technology. As my recorded voice filled the room, I heard not the confident speaker I thought I had become, but a thin, nasal sound that seemed to drain authority from even my most carefully crafted words. That shocking encounter with my recorded voice launched an intensive study of vocal development that would transform not only how I sounded, but how audiences responded to my messages. I realized that voice is the vehicle that carries all spoken communication, and if that vehicle is weak, unreliable, or unpleasant, even the best content will fail to reach its destination effectively. I began working with a voice coach in Kansas City, an elderly German woman named Mrs. Brunhilde Koch, who had trained opera singers before turning her attention to speakers and actors. She taught me that voice, like any instrument, could be developed through proper technique and consistent practice. More importantly, she showed me that vocal authority comes not from volume or artificial deepening, but from breath control, resonance, and what she called intention. The foundation of vocal confidence, I learned, is proper breathing. Most people, especially when nervous, breathe shallowly from their chest, which creates a weak, sometimes shaky voice that cannot sustain long phrases or project clearly to the back of a room. Mrs. Koch taught me diaphragmatic breathing, drawing air deep into my lungs, using the large muscle below them rather than just expanding my chest. This deeper breathing had multiple benefits beyond vocal power. It naturally calmed my nervous system, providing a physiological antidote to speaking anxiety. It allowed me to speak longer phrases without running out of breath, which improved the flow and rhythm of my delivery. Most importantly, it gave my voice a fullness and resonance that conveyed confidence even when I didn't fully feel it internally. I practiced breathing exercises daily, learning to maintain steady airflow while speaking and to use breath strategically for emphasis and pacing. I discovered that pausing to breathe properly wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a tool for creating anticipation, allowing important points to sink in, and maintaining vocal strength throughout long presentations. Resonance became my next focus. Mrs. Koch taught me to think of my entire torso as a resonating chamber, not just my throat and mouth. By relaxing my throat, opening my mouth adequately, and allowing sound to resonate in my chest, I developed a richer, more authoritative vocal quality that carried better and sounded more confident. I learned that tension is the enemy of good vocal production. When nervous, people tend to tighten their throat, jaw, and facial muscles, which creates a strained, unnatural sound. Through exercises and conscious practice, I developed the ability to maintain vocal relaxation even under pressure, which allowed my natural voice to emerge clearly and powerfully, Pace and rhythm became crucial elements of vocal authority. I discovered that speaking too quickly, which nervous speakers often do, reduces comprehension and suggests anxiety. Speaking too slowly can bore audiences and suggest lack of energy or preparation. The key was finding a natural conversational pace that allowed for proper pronunciation while maintaining energy and engagement. I practiced varying my pace, strategically slowing down for important points to ensure they were absorbed, speeding up slightly during transitions or less critical information, and using pauses effectively for emphasis and dramatic effect. This vocal variety kept audiences engaged and helped them follow the logical structure of my presentations. Volume control proved more nuanced than simply speaking loudly enough to be heard. I learned to project my voice to the back row without shouting, to use quieter moments for intimacy and emphasis, and to adjust my volume based on room acoustics and audience size. Proper projection came from breath support and resonance rather than strain or force. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered the concept of vocal intention, infusing my voice with the emotion and conviction behind my words. Mrs. Koch taught me that audiences hear not just what you say, but how much you believe it. A voice that lacks conviction, regardless of perfect technique, will fail to move or persuade listeners. I practiced speaking with various emotional colors: enthusiasm, concern, determination, compassion, learning to let my genuine feelings about my content come through in my vocal delivery. This wasn't artificial emotion, but rather the authentic expression of my true response to the ideas I was sharing. The transformation was remarkable. My recorded voice changed from thin and uncertain to rich and authoritative. Audiences began responding more positively to my presentations, often commenting on how compelling or convincing I sounded. More importantly, I felt more confident because I could hear the authority in my own voice. I learned that vocal confidence creates a positive feedback loop. When you sound confident, audiences respond as if you are confident, which makes you feel more confident, which improves your vocal delivery. The voice becomes both a reflection of internal confidence and a tool for building it. I also discovered that vocal development requires ongoing maintenance. Like physical fitness, vocal strength and flexibility must be maintained through regular practice and conscious attention. I developed warm-up routines for important speaking engagements and daily practices for maintaining vocal health and development. One of the most valuable lessons was learning to adapt my vocal delivery to different speaking situations. Intimate conversations required a different vocal approach than large auditorium presentations. Formal business settings called for different vocal qualities than casual educational workshops. I learned to read the environment and adjust my vocal delivery accordingly while maintaining authenticity. The breakthrough moment came during a presentation to a skeptical audience of businessmen who had initially appeared dismissive of my message. As I spoke with proper breath support, clear resonance, appropriate pace, and genuine conviction, I watched their body language shift from closed skepticism to engaged interest. My voice had carried my message past their initial resistance and created the opening for real communication. That day, I fully understood that voice is not just about being heard, it's about being believed, respected, and followed. A voice that commands attention doesn't demand it through volume or artifice, but earns it through the authentic expression of genuine conviction supported by solid technique. When your voice truly represents who you are and what you believe, it becomes one of your most powerful tools for creating positive influence in the world. The most terrifying moment of my speaking career occurred on a cold February evening in 1913, when I faced an audience that seemed determined to destroy me before I spoke my first word. I had been invited to address a group of factory workers in Chicago about the benefits of adult education, But I walked into a room thick with hostility, skepticism, and barely contained anger. The workers had been forced to attend by their employer, who had arranged my presentation as part of a company improvement initiative they viewed with deep suspicion. They saw me as another privileged outsider coming to lecture them about bettering themselves while their wages remained low and their working conditions remained dangerous. Before I even reached the podium, I could hear muttered comments questioning my credentials, my motives, and my right to speak to them at all. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to make excuses and escape this hostile environment before it destroyed my confidence and reputation. But something deeper than fear kept me at that podium, a genuine desire to serve these hard-working people, and a growing understanding that hostile audiences often mask deep pain and legitimate concerns that deserve respectful attention. Instead of beginning with my prepared remarks, I did something that would revolutionize my approach to difficult speaking situations forever. I acknowledged the elephant in the room. I spoke directly about the tension in the air, admitted that I was an outsider who might not fully understand their daily struggles, and asked them to help me understand their perspective before I shared mine. The effect was immediate and transformative. The hostile muttering stopped, replaced by surprised attention. Several hands went up with questions and comments about working conditions, educational barriers, and economic pressures. For the next 20 minutes, I listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, and demonstrated genuine interest in their experiences and concerns. As I listened, something remarkable happened to both the audience and to me. Their hostility began to melt as they realized I was treating them with respect and genuine curiosity rather than condescension. My own nervousness dissolved as I became absorbed in understanding their world rather than defending my position. We were no longer adversaries, we had become collaborators in exploring important issues. When I finally began my presentation, it was no longer the speech I had prepared. Instead, I spoke directly to the concerns they had raised, sharing relevant stories and practical strategies that addressed their specific situations. I acknowledged the real barriers they faced while offering hope and concrete steps they could take despite those obstacles. By the end of the evening, the same men who had greeted me with suspicion were asking detailed questions, sharing their own experiences, and requesting information about educational opportunities in their area. Several approached me afterward to thank me personally and to ask for advice on specific situations. That transformative experience taught me the first principle of handling hostile audiences. Hostility is often a mask for pain, fear, or legitimate concern. When you respond to the underlying emotions rather than reacting to the surface hostility, you can transform adversaries into allies. I began developing systematic approaches for difficult audience situations. The foundation was always empathy, a genuine effort to understand why audience members might be resistant, skeptical, or angry. Often, their hostility had nothing to do with me personally and everything to do with past experiences, current pressures, or fears about change. Preparation became even more critical for potentially hostile situations. I learned to research not just my topic, but my audience's likely objections, concerns, and perspectives. I prepared responses to probable challenges, but more importantly, I prepared myself emotionally to receive criticism without becoming defensive. I discovered that acknowledging opposition directly and respectfully often diffused it more effectively than trying to ignore it or overwhelm it with enthusiasm. When audiences sensed that I was willing to engage with their concerns rather than dismiss them, they became more willing to engage with my ideas. Body language became crucial in hostile situations. Defensive postures, crossed arms, rigid stance, stepping backward, confirmed audiences' suspicions that I was an adversary. Open postures, shoulders, visible hands, stepping toward rather than away from questioners, demonstrated confidence and willingness to engage. I learned specific techniques for handling direct challenges and hostile questions. Instead of becoming defensive, I would thank questioners for raising important points, restate their concerns to ensure I understood correctly, and then address them thoughtfully and thoroughly. This approach often turned my harshest critics into my strongest supporters. Vocal tone became especially important with difficult audiences. A defensive or condescending tone could inflame hostility, while a calm, respectful tone could diffuse tension. I practiced maintaining warmth and authority simultaneously, even when facing harsh criticism or unfair attacks. I discovered that hostile audiences often provided the greatest opportunities for connection and impact. When you successfully win over skeptics, you create more loyal supporters than you ever could with naturally friendly audiences. People who have been convinced by your respectful engagement with their concerns become powerful advocates for your message. One of my most valuable lessons came from a particularly aggressive businessman who challenged my presentation about human relations in the workplace. Instead of defending my position, I asked him to share his experiences and perspectives. His 20-minute explanation of his management philosophy revealed both wisdom and pain that helped me understand his resistance. By the end of our exchange, he had become an unexpected ally who enriched my presentation with his insights and gave other audience members permission to engage openly with my ideas. His business card, which he gave me afterward with a request to continue our conversation, became a treasured reminder that enemies can become friends when treated with respect and genuine interest. I learned that handling hostile audiences requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of seeing resistance as something to overcome, I began viewing it as information to understand. Instead of seeing hostile questioners as enemies, I began seeing them as people with legitimate concerns that deserved thoughtful response. This approach required genuine humility, the willingness to admit when I didn't know something, to acknowledge valid criticisms, and to modify my positions when presented with compelling evidence. But this humility, rather than weakening my authority, actually strengthened it by demonstrating intellectual honesty and genuine respect for my audiences. The most profound discovery was that hostile audiences often taught me more than friendly ones. They forced me to think more deeply about my positions, to develop more nuanced understanding of complex issues, and to become more skillful at communication under pressure. They made me a better speaker and a more thoughtful person. By learning to handle hostility with grace, respect, and genuine engagement, I discovered that there are very few truly hostile audiences, only audiences with concerns that haven't been properly understood or addressed. When you approach resistance with curiosity rather than defensiveness, you often find that your greatest critics can become your most valuable teachers and eventually your most loyal supporters. Asterisk, the revelation that would transform my speaking from merely informative to genuinely transformative came during a lecture I was giving about agricultural innovation to a room full of tired farmers. On a hot summer evening in 1914, I had prepared a comprehensive presentation filled with statistics, research findings, and theoretical frameworks about improved farming techniques. But as I watched my audience's eyes glazing over and heads beginning to nod, I realized that facts alone would never create the connection I sought. Abandoning my prepared remarks mid-sentence, I found myself telling a story about my neighbor, Old Man Henderson, who had refused to try new planting methods until a devastating drought forced him to experiment with crop rotation. I described his initial skepticism, his grudging willingness to try something different, and his amazement when his experimental field yielded twice the harvest of his traditional plots. The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Farmers who had been slumping in their chairs sat up straight. Eyes that had been distant became focused and engaged. When I finished Henderson's story, Hands shot up with questions about specific techniques, personal experiences, and practical applications. These men weren't just hearing information anymore, they were connecting with a human experience they could understand and relate to. That evening taught me that stories don't just convey information, they transfer experience. When you tell a story effectively, your audience doesn't just learn about an idea. They live through an experience that makes the idea real, memorable, and personally relevant. Stories transform abstract concepts into concrete realities that people can grasp, remember, and act upon. I began studying the art of storytelling with the same intensity I had applied to voice training and audience analysis. I discovered that effective stories for speaking follow predictable patterns that create emotional engagement and deliver practical insight. Every powerful story contains a relatable character facing a recognizable challenge, attempting solutions that audiences can understand, and achieving outcomes that provide clear lessons. The key to powerful storytelling, I learned, is specificity. Vague, generalized narratives fail to engage audiences because they lack the concrete details that make stories feel real and immediate. I practiced describing specific moments, particular conversations, precise actions, and detailed outcomes that allowed audiences to visualize and experience the events I was describing. Character development became crucial for connection. Audiences needed to see themselves in the people I described, which meant presenting characters as real, flawed human beings rather than perfect heroes or obvious villains. When I told stories about successful people, I included their struggles, doubts, and failures. When I described challenging situations, I showed how ordinary people found extraordinary strength and wisdom. I learned to use sensory details to make stories vivid and memorable. Instead of simply saying that someone was nervous, I would describe sweaty palms, a racing heart, or a shaky voice. Instead of stating that a situation was difficult, I would paint a picture that allowed audiences to feel the tension, see the obstacles, and understand the emotional stakes involved. Dialogue became one of my most powerful storytelling tools. When I included actual conversations in my stories, audiences felt like they were eavesdropping on real interactions rather than listening to second-hand reports. I learned to use different voices, varied speech patterns, and authentic language that reflected each character's personality and background. The emotional arc of stories proved essential for impact. Effective narratives take audiences on emotional journeys from confusion to clarity, from despair to hope, from fear to courage. I structured my stories to create emotional investment in the outcomes and to generate feelings that supported my key messages. I discovered that the most powerful stories were often personal experiences that demonstrated vulnerability and growth. When I shared my own struggles with confidence, my failures and setbacks, and my journey toward improvement, audiences connected with me as a fellow human being rather than viewing me as an untouchable expert lecturing from above. But I also learned that personal stories must serve the audience's needs rather than the speaker's ego. The point of sharing personal experiences wasn't to showcase my achievements or gain sympathy for my struggles, but to provide insights and encouragement that could help others in their own journeys. I began collecting stories, keeping detailed notes about experiences, conversations, and observations that could illustrate important principles. I recorded not just my own experiences, but stories I heard from others with their permission that provided powerful examples of human nature, personal growth, and practical wisdom. The structure of my presentations evolved to integrate stories seamlessly with content. Instead of adding stories as decorative elements, I used narratives as the primary vehicles for delivering key insights. Each major point became anchored by a story that made the principle concrete and memorable. I learned to match stories to audience needs and characteristics. Business audiences responded to stories about workplace challenges and professional growth. Educational groups connected with narratives about learning and teaching. Community organizations appreciated stories about neighbors helping neighbors, and local problem solving. The timing of stories within presentations became crucial for maximum impact. Opening stories created immediate connection and set emotional tone. Transition stories helped audiences move smoothly between different concepts. Closing stories provided memorable summaries and calls to action. Crisis stories could recapture wandering attention and refocus energy. One of my most valuable discoveries was that stories create permission for change. When audiences hear narratives about other people successfully overcoming similar challenges, they begin to believe that such change is possible for them as well. Stories provide both inspiration and practical blueprints for personal transformation. I also learned that humor, when appropriate and authentic, could enhance storytelling power dramatically. Not forced jokes or artificial entertainment, but genuine moments of human comedy that arise naturally from real situations. These moments of shared laughter created bonds between speaker and audience that enhanced receptivity to serious messages. The feedback from audiences became overwhelmingly positive as my storytelling skills developed. People began telling me that they remembered my stories long after forgetting other speakers, statistics, and theories. More importantly, they reported taking action based on insights gained from narratives that had made abstract principles concrete and achievable. I realized that storytelling taps into fundamental aspects of human psychology and learning. People have been sharing stories to teach, inspire, and connect for thousands of years. Stories engage multiple parts of the brain, create emotional investment, and provide memorable frameworks for organizing and recalling information. The ultimate validation of storytelling's power came when audience members began sharing their own stories with me, narratives of challenges overcome, lessons learned, and changes implemented based on insights gained from the stories I had shared. I had discovered that stories don't just inform or entertain. They inspire and empower people to write better stories with their own lives. This understanding of narrative power became central to my teaching methodology and would eventually influence millions of people learning to communicate more effectively. Stories, I learned, are not just tools for speakers. They are the fundamental language of human connection, understanding, and transformation. Asterisk, asterisk. Even after years of successful speaking, I still remember the crushing weight of anxiety that would settle on my chest before important presentations. My hands would shake, my mouth would go dry, and my mind would race with catastrophic predictions about everything that could go wrong. For a long time, I believed that confident speakers were people who didn't experience these feelings, and I felt like an imposter who would eventually be exposed as a fraud. The breakthrough in my understanding came during a conversation with Dr. William James, the renowned psychologist, whom I had the privilege of meeting at a conference in Boston in 1915, when I confessed my ongoing struggles with pre-speaking anxiety. He surprised me by laughing warmly and saying, "My dear Carnegie, if you weren't nervous before important presentations, I would be worried about your mental health." Dr. James explained that nervousness before significant events is not a character flaw or a sign of inadequacy. It's evidence that your mind and body are preparing for peak performance. The same physiological responses that we label as anxiety, when they feel uncomfortable, are actually our body's way of marshalling energy, sharpening focus, and preparing for extraordinary effort. This reframe was revolutionary for me. Instead of fighting my nervous energy or viewing it as evidence of weakness, I began learning to harness it as fuel for more dynamic, engaging presentations. The goal wasn't to eliminate nervousness, but to channel it productively. I developed what I came to call my pre-performance protocol. a systematic approach to managing nervous energy that transformed anxiety from an enemy into an ally. The foundation was proper preparation, not just of content, but of mindset and physiology. Physical preparation became crucial. I learned that nervous energy often manifests as muscle tension, shallow breathing, and restless movement. To counteract these effects, I developed a routine of deep breathing exercises, gentle stretching, and purposeful movement that helped regulate my nervous system and channel energy constructively. The breathing technique was particularly powerful. I would spend 10 minutes before each presentation practicing deep, diaphragmatic breathing, inhaling slowly for 4 counts, holding for 4 counts, and exhaling slowly for 6 counts. This simple practice activated my parasympathetic nervous system, reducing heart rate and creating a sense of calm alertness. Mental preparation involved replacing catastrophic thinking with realistic assessment and positive visualization. Instead of imagining everything that could go wrong, I trained myself to visualize successful outcomes, seeing myself connecting with audiences, delivering value, and handling challenges gracefully. This wasn't naive optimism, but deliberate mental rehearsal that prepared my mind for success. I learned to reframe the physical sensations of nervousness using more empowering language. Instead of telling myself I'm terrified, I would say I'm energized. Instead of my heart is racing with fear, I would think my body is preparing for peak performance. This cognitive reframing didn't eliminate the sensations, but changed my relationship with them. One of my most valuable discoveries was the power of perspective. Before each presentation, I would remind myself of my genuine purpose to serve my audience with valuable insights and encouragement. When I focused on contributing to others rather than protecting myself from judgment, my anxiety naturally diminished because my attention shifted from self-consciousness to service. I also developed contingency planning as an antidote to worry. Instead of vaguely fearing that something might go wrong, I would specifically identify potential challenges and prepare responses. What if I lost my place in my presentation? I would have clear note cards. What if someone asked a hostile question? I had practiced graceful ways to acknowledge and address criticism. This preparation eliminated the unknown factors that fed anxiety. The concept of nervous energy conversion became central to my approach. I learned to view pre-speaking jitters as raw energy that could be transformed into enthusiasm, passion, and dynamic delivery. The same physiological arousal that created uncomfortable anxiety could fuel compelling presentations when properly channeled. I practiced techniques for managing anxiety during presentations as well as before them. When I felt nervousness rising while speaking, I would use purposeful movement to discharge nervous energy, maintain steady eye contact with friendly faces in the audience, and return to my breathing foundation to maintain vocal control and mental clarity. Recovery from mistakes became an essential skill. Early in my career, any error during a presentation would trigger cascading anxiety that could derail my entire talk. I learned to treat mistakes as normal parts of human communication, acknowledge them briefly when appropriate, and return immediately to my main message without dwelling on imperfection. I discovered that audiences are remarkably forgiving of speakers who handle nervousness gracefully. When I occasionally acknowledged feeling honored to address them or excited about sharing important ideas, audiences responded with warmth and support. They appreciated authenticity more than artificial perfection. The practice of progressive exposure helped build my confidence systematically. Instead of avoiding anxiety-provoking situations, I gradually sought out more challenging speaking opportunities. Each successful experience in a difficult context increased my confidence and reduced anxiety for future similar situations. I learned to distinguish between productive nervousness and destructive anxiety. Productive nervousness energized my preparation, sharpened my focus, and enhanced my performance. Destructive anxiety paralyzed my thinking, undermined my confidence, and interfered with my ability to serve my audience effectively. Self-compassion became crucial for managing performance anxiety. When I spoke to myself with the same kindness I would show a good friend facing similar challenges, my internal criticism lost its power to amplify nervousness. I learned to treat myself as a student in the ongoing school of public speaking rather than as a defendant on trial for my competence. The most profound shift came when I realized that a certain level of nervousness before important presentations was not only normal but beneficial. It indicated that I cared about my performance, that I took my responsibility to my audience seriously, and that my mind and body were preparing to give their best effort. I began teaching other speakers that the goal is not to eliminate nervousness, but to dance with it, to acknowledge its presence, harness its energy, and use it to fuel more authentic, dynamic communication. When you stop fighting your nervous system and start working with it, anxiety transforms from an obstacle into an asset. This understanding revolutionized not only my speaking, but my entire approach to challenging situations. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and taking meaningful action anyway. Some of my most successful presentations occurred when I was most nervous beforehand, because that nervous energy, properly channeled, created presentations that were more alive, more authentic, and more impactful than any I could have delivered in a state of comfortable complacency. The journey from being controlled by anxiety to channeling nervous energy taught me that our emotional responses to challenging situations are not fixed character traits, but skills that can be developed, refined, and transformed through understanding, practice, and patience with ourselves. My understanding of how confident speaking creates genuine influence came through years of observing, experimenting, and analyzing what separates speakers who merely inform from those who truly transform their audiences. By 1916, I had spoken to thousands of people and witnessed countless examples of how certain speakers could move audiences to action, while others, equally knowledgeable and well-intentioned, left people unchanged and unmotivated. The revelation began with a simple observation. The most influential speakers weren't necessarily the most eloquent, the most educated, or even the most charismatic. What distinguished truly influential communicators was their ability to create what I came to call psychological bridges, connections between their message and their audience's existing beliefs, values, and aspirations. I started studying the elements that made some presentations forgettable, while others inspired lasting change. I observed successful speakers, analyzed my own most effective presentations, and interviewed audience members about what moved them to take action. What emerged was a clear understanding of the psychological principles that govern human influence through spoken communication. The foundation of all influence, I discovered, is credibility. But credibility isn't just about expertise or credentials, it's about the audience's perception that you understand their world, share their concerns, and have their best interests at heart. Speakers who established this emotional credibility could influence audiences even when they lacked formal qualifications, while those who failed to connect personally struggled to create change regardless of their expertise. I learned to build credibility through what I called common ground establishment. This meant demonstrating, early and often, that I shared experiences, values, or challenges with my audience. When speaking to business groups, I would share my own entrepreneurial struggles. When addressing educators, I would discuss my teaching experiences. This wasn't manipulation, but authentic connection, based on genuine shared experience. The second pillar of influence was emotional engagement. I discovered that people make decisions emotionally and then justify them rationally. Speakers who appealed only to logic, no matter how compelling their arguments, rarely inspired significant action. But those who could engage emotions while providing rational support created powerful motivation for change. I learned to weave emotional elements throughout my presentations through vivid stories, compelling imagery, and direct appeals to values that mattered to my audiences. When discussing the importance of education, I wouldn't just cite statistics about economic benefits. I would paint pictures of children whose lives were transformed by learning, of communities that prospered through knowledge, of individuals who discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. The concept of resistance, anticipation, became crucial for effective influence. I realized that audiences naturally resist change, even when they intellectually recognize its benefits. Effective influencers acknowledge this resistance directly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. They address concerns, validate hesitations, and provide reassurance that change is both possible and worthwhile. I developed techniques for making change seem achievable rather than overwhelming. Instead of asking audiences to transform their entire lives, I would suggest small, specific actions they could take immediately. I learned that people are more likely to commit to minor changes that feel manageable, and these small successes often lead to larger transformations over time. The principle of social proof proved remarkably powerful for creating influence. People are more likely to take action when they believe others like them have done so successfully. I began incorporating examples of ordinary people who had achieved extraordinary results, emphasizing that these success stories involved individuals similar to my audience members. I learned to use what I called aspirational identification, helping audience members see themselves in the success stories I shared. When speaking to struggling farmers, I wouldn't just tell them about agricultural innovations. I would describe how other farmers with similar challenges had implemented these changes and improved their situations. The key was making success seem not just possible but inevitable for people willing to take action. Timing within presentations became crucial for influence. I discovered that audiences are most receptive to calls for action after they've been emotionally engaged, intellectually convinced, and personally encouraged. Too early, and they haven't been sufficiently motivated. Too late, and their energy has dissipated. The optimal moment comes when emotional investment peaks and logical understanding is complete. The language of influence required careful attention to how ideas were framed and presented. Instead of focusing on what people needed to give up or sacrifice, I learned to emphasize what they would gain. Instead of highlighting problems exclusively, I would paint vivid pictures of solutions and their benefits. Instead of using abstract language, I employed concrete, specific terms that created clear mental images. I discovered the power of participatory involvement, getting audiences actively engaged in the presentation rather than passively receiving information. When people responded to questions, shared experiences, or participated in exercises, they became psychologically invested in the ideas being discussed. This investment dramatically increased the likelihood that they would act on the insights they gained. The concept of authority transfer became another tool for influence. I learned to position myself not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who had discovered valuable insights from others and was sharing these discoveries for the audience's benefit. This approach reduced resistance while maintaining credibility and made audiences more receptive to the ideas I was presenting. Repetition and reinforcement proved essential for lasting influence. Important concepts needed to be presented multiple times in different ways throughout a presentation. I would introduce an idea, illustrate it with a story, reinforce it with evidence, and summarize it at the end. This redundancy ensured that key messages were understood, remembered, and internalized. I learned that genuine influence requires respect for the audience's autonomy and intelligence. Manipulation and high-pressure tactics might create temporary compliance, but they rarely lead to lasting change. and often generate resentment. True influence comes from helping people discover what they already know to be true and empowering them to act on their own best judgment. The follow-through component of influence became increasingly important in my understanding. The most persuasive presentation means nothing if audience members leave without clear next steps and ongoing support. I began providing specific action plans, contact information, and follow-up resources that helped people translate inspiration into implementation. Perhaps, most importantly, I discovered that the most powerful influence comes from speakers who are themselves living examples of the principles they advocate. When your own life demonstrates the value of what you're teaching, your influence multiplies exponentially. Audiences can sense authenticity, and they respond to speakers who embody their message rather than merely delivering it. This deep understanding of influence through speech became the foundation for my later work in human relations and personal development. I realized that the same principles that made speakers influential could help anyone become more persuasive, more respected, and more effective in all their human interactions. The science of influence through speech was really the science of authentic human connection and mutual empowerment. The most profound transformation in my understanding of confident speaking came not from my own successes, but from watching others discover their voices under my guidance. In 1912, I had begun teaching small groups of business professionals in New York City, and what I witnessed in those early classes forever changed my perspective on human potential and the nature of confidence itself. My first student was a man named Arthur Morrison, a talented accountant whose brilliant analytical mind was trapped behind crippling shyness. During our initial meeting, he could barely make eye contact and spoke in whispers so soft I had to lean forward to hear him. He had been passed over for promotion repeatedly because, despite his competence, he couldn't communicate his ideas effectively in meetings or presentations. I'll never forget our first session. Arthur stood before our small group of 8 students, trembling visibly as he attempted to introduce himself. His voice cracked, his hands shook, and after just 2 sentences, he sat down abruptly, convinced he had failed. In that moment, I saw myself 15 years earlier terrified, ashamed, and certain that confident speaking was impossible for someone like him. But over the following weeks, something magical began to unfold. As Arthur practiced in our supportive environment, sharing stories from his own experience and gradually building on small successes, I watched his transformation with amazement. His voice grew stronger, his posture improved, and most remarkably, his personality began to emerge. The quiet, withdrawn man revealed himself to be witty, insightful, and genuinely caring about others' success. The breakthrough came during his 4th presentation, when Arthur shared a story about helping his elderly neighbor navigate a complex financial problem. As he described the woman's confusion and his patient efforts to explain complicated concepts in simple terms, his entire demeanor changed. He forgot to be nervous because he was absorbed in helping his audience understand something important. His voice became animated, his gestures natural, and his connection with the group genuine and powerful. That evening, watching Arthur receive enthusiastic applause and genuine appreciation from his fellow students, I experienced what I can only describe as a revelation about human nature. I realized that confident speaking isn't a rare talent possessed by a gifted few. It's a natural human capacity that gets buried under layers of fear, self-doubt, and negative experience. My role as a teacher wasn't to give people abilities they lacked, but to help them rediscover abilities they already possessed. This insight revolutionized my teaching methodology. Instead of focusing primarily on techniques and skills, I began concentrating on creating conditions where students could safely explore their authentic voices. I learned that the most powerful transformations occurred when people stopped trying to be perfect speakers and started trying to be helpful human beings who happened to be speaking. I developed what I called the safe practice principle. Students needed an environment where mistakes were expected, learning was celebrated, and progress was measured in small increments rather than dramatic leaps. I created exercises that gradually built confidence through manageable challenges, starting with simple self-introductions and progressing slowly toward more complex presentations. The group dynamic became crucial for individual transformation. I discovered that when students supported each other's growth, shared their own struggles, and celebrated small victories together, they created a powerful collective energy that accelerated everyone's development. The camaraderie that developed in these classes often lasted for years, with former students continuing to meet and support each other's ongoing growth. One of my most important discoveries was that different people needed different approaches to find their confidence. Some students, like Arthur, needed gentle encouragement and gradual exposure. Others required firm challenges that pushed them past their comfort zones. Some learned best through structured exercises, while others thrived with spontaneous speaking opportunities. I learned to recognize the unique barriers each student faced. Some people were held back by perfectionism. They were so afraid of making mistakes that they never allowed themselves to try. Others suffered from comparison syndrome, constantly measuring themselves against idealized standards that no one could meet. Still others were trapped by past failures or criticism that had convinced them they were fundamentally inadequate speakers. For perfectionists, I emphasized that communication is about connection, not performance. I would deliberately make minor mistakes during my own presentations to demonstrate that imperfection doesn't destroy effectiveness. I taught them that audiences care more about sincerity and helpfulness than about flawless delivery. For those trapped by comparison, I helped them discover their unique strengths and perspectives. Instead of trying to copy other speakers' styles, I encouraged them to develop their own authentic approaches based on their personalities, experiences, and natural abilities. I showed them that diversity in speaking styles serves audiences better than uniformity for those haunted by past failures. I provided new experiences that gradually replaced negative associations with positive ones. Small successes in supportive environments began to outweigh historical disappointments. I taught them that past failures were information about inexperience, not evidence of fundamental inability. The teaching process taught me as much as it taught my students. I learned that confidence is contagious when you genuinely believe in someone's potential. They begin to believe in it themselves. I discovered that specific, authentic praise is more powerful than general encouragement. Telling someone your story about your grandmother really helped me understand that concept has far more impact than saying good job. I also learned that breakthrough moments often come after periods of apparent stagnation. Students would seem to plateau for weeks, making minimal progress, and then suddenly experience dramatic improvement. I learned to trust the process and help students maintain faith during these challenging periods. The ripple effects of teaching confident speaking extended far beyond presentation skills. As students gained confidence in expressing themselves, they became more assertive in their careers, more authentic in their relationships, and more willing to pursue opportunities they had previously avoided. I watched accountants become department heads, teachers become principals, and small business owners become community leaders. The most rewarding aspect of teaching was witnessing the moment when students realized they had something valuable to offer others, when they shifted from worrying about their own performance to focusing on serving their audiences. Their speaking transformed dramatically. They discovered that they didn't need to be perfect, they just needed to be helpful. These teaching experiences also taught me that confident speaking skills could be systematized and replicated. What worked for one student often worked for others facing similar challenges. This insight led me to develop more structured curricula and eventually to write materials that could help people even when I couldn't work with them personally. But perhaps the most profound lesson from teaching others was the confirmation that human potential is virtually unlimited when people receive the right combination of encouragement, practical guidance, and safe practice opportunities. Every student who walked into my classes convinced they couldn't speak confidently eventually proved themselves wrong. They taught me that the only real barrier to confident communication is the belief that it's impossible. Watching ordinary people discover extraordinary capabilities within themselves became the driving force behind my life's work. Those early students didn't just learn to speak confidently, they taught me that helping others find their voices might be the most important contribution anyone can make to the world. By 1918, what had begun as a small experiment in helping a few business professionals speak more confidently had grown into something I had never imagined, a movement that was transforming lives across the country. Letters began arriving from former students who had moved to different cities, telling me about the promotions they had received, the leadership roles they had accepted, and the ways their newfound confidence had improved every aspect of their lives. One letter that moved me deeply came from Margaret Sullivan, a former student who had been one of the first women to enroll in my classes. When she joined us in 1915, she was a secretary who had brilliant ideas but couldn't voice them in meetings dominated by men. 3 years later, she wrote to tell me that she had been promoted to department supervisor and was using the principles I had taught to help other women in her company find their voices. "Mr. Carnegie," she wrote, "you didn't just teach me to speak confidently, you taught me to believe in the value of my thoughts and the importance of sharing them. But more than that, you showed me how to help others discover the same confidence." I now have 6 women in my department who are speaking up in meetings, contributing ideas, and advancing in their careers because they learned that their voices matter. This letter crystallized something I had been sensing but hadn't fully articulated. The greatest impact of confident speaking wasn't just individual transformation, but the ripple effect that occurred when confident speakers helped others find their voices. Every person who learned to communicate effectively became a potential teacher and encourager for countless others. I began to envision something far grander than individual classes or even individual schools. I saw the possibility of creating a systematic approach to developing confident communication that could spread across the nation and eventually around the world. The vision was ambitious: to help create a society where every person felt empowered to express their ideas, share their experiences, and contribute their unique perspectives to the communities where they lived and worked. This vision required more than just teaching individuals, required training teachers who could carry these principles to places I could never reach personally. I began developing what I called the Instructor Certification Program, designed to prepare exceptional former students to establish their own classes and teach others using the methods we had refined together. The selection process for instructor candidates was rigorous. Technical speaking ability, while important, wasn't the primary criterion. I looked for individuals who genuinely cared about others' development, who had experienced significant personal transformation through confident speaking, and who possessed the patience and wisdom necessary for effective teaching. Most importantly, I sought people who understood that teaching confident speaking was about far more than technique. It was about helping people discover their inherent worth and potential. The first group of certified instructors included Arthur Morrison, whose own transformation from terrified accountant to confident leader had been so dramatic. Also selected were Catherine Reed, a former teacher who had overcome debilitating stage fright, and James Patterson, a salesman who had tripled his income after learning to communicate with authority and authenticity. Training these instructor candidates taught me as much as it taught them. I learned that effective teaching of confident speaking required a deep understanding of human psychology, not just communication technique. Instructors needed to recognize different personality types, identify various sources of speaking anxiety, and adapt their approaches to meet individual student needs. We developed detailed curricula that maintained consistency across different locations while allowing for local adaptation and instructor personality. The core principles remained constant: the importance of genuine service to audiences, the power of authentic expression, the value of systematic practice, but the specific applications could vary based on regional needs and cultural contexts. The most challenging aspect of building this instructor network was maintaining quality and consistency. I established regular communication systems, periodic training updates, and a peer support network that allowed instructors to share successful techniques and learn from each other's experiences. We created detailed manuals, but more importantly, we fostered a culture of continuous learning and improvement. As the network of certified instructors grew, so did the feedback about student transformations. Reports came in from across the country about shy individuals becoming confident leaders, struggling salespeople achieving remarkable success, and quiet community members stepping forward to tackle local challenges. The cumulative impact was staggering and deeply inspiring. One particularly powerful report came from an instructor in rural Oklahoma who had been working with farmers facing economic hardship during the post-war recession. These men had been struggling not just with financial challenges, but with their inability to communicate effectively with bankers, suppliers, and government officials who could help them. After completing our confidence-building program, they had organized themselves into an effective advocacy group that successfully lobbied for agricultural support programs that saved dozens of farms. The success stories weren't limited to dramatic transformations. Often the most meaningful impacts were subtle but profound. Children who saw their parents speaking confidently at school meetings began to express themselves more freely in class. Wives whose husbands had learned to communicate respectfully began to share their own ideas and aspirations. Employees whose supervisors had developed listening skills felt more valued and engaged in their work. I realized that we were creating something unprecedented, a systematic approach to developing human potential that could scale to reach millions of people. The principles we had discovered through years of trial and error were being refined, tested, and proven effective across diverse populations and circumstances. The international expansion began almost accidentally. In 1920, a Canadian businessman who had completed our program in New York asked if he could establish similar classes in Toronto. His success led to inquiries from England, Australia, and eventually countries around the world. Each new location required adaptation to local cultures and languages, but the fundamental human needs for confidence and effective communication proved universal. As the movement grew, I began receiving invitations to speak at major conferences, universities, and corporate events. These larger platforms allowed me to share our discoveries with broader audiences and to recruit new instructor candidates who could carry the work into their own communities and organizations. The most rewarding aspect of this expansion was witnessing the development of a global community of people committed to helping others find their voices. Former students became instructors, instructors trained other instructors, and gradually a network emerged of individuals who shared a common mission, empowering people to communicate with confidence and authenticity. But with growth came responsibilities and challenges I hadn't anticipated. Maintaining quality control across hundreds of instructors required constant attention. Protecting the integrity of our methods while allowing for innovation and adaptation demanded careful balance. Most importantly, ensuring that our expansion served students' needs rather than just organizational growth required ongoing vigilance and principled decision-making. The letters from students and instructors became my constant reminder of why this work mattered. Each story of transformation, each report of lives changed and communities improved, reinforced my conviction that helping people find their voices was among the most important work anyone could do. By 1925, what had begun as a small class for nervous speakers had become an international movement affecting hundreds of thousands of lives. But I knew this was just the beginning. The principles we had discovered and the methods we had developed had the potential to reach millions more people who were still trapped by fear, limited by self-doubt, and held back from contributing their full potential to the world. The legacy I envisioned wasn't just an organization or a set of techniques. It was a fundamental shift in how human beings approached communication, relationship building, and personal development. I wanted to help create a world where confident, authentic communication was the norm rather than the exception, where every person felt empowered to share their unique gifts, and where communities benefited from the full range of perspectives and ideas their members could offer. Asterisk, as I reflect on this journey from a stammering farm boy to someone who has helped millions find their voice, I want to leave you with the most practical and powerful insights I've discovered. Everything I've shared with you, every principle, every technique, every revelation means nothing unless you apply it to your own life. Your transformation begins not when you finish reading these words, but when you take your first concrete step toward confident speaking. The foundation of your action plan must be the recognition that confident speaking is not a talent you're born with or without tits, a skill you develop through understanding, practice, and persistence. Every person who speaks confidently today was once where you are now, facing the same fears, harboring the same doubts, and wondering if transformation was truly possible for them. Start with your mindset. Right now, today, make a fundamental decision about how you will view speaking opportunities. Instead of seeing them as tests of your worth or threats to your ego, begin viewing them as chances to serve others with your unique insights and experiences. This shift in perspective from self-focus to service focus will eliminate much of your anxiety automatically and create the foundation for genuine confidence. Your first practical step is to seek out small, supportive speaking opportunities where you can practice without high stakes. This might be sharing a story at a family dinner, volunteering to give a toast at a friend's celebration, or offering to present an idea at a work meeting. The goal isn't perfection, but practice getting comfortable with the feeling of having others' attention and learning to express yourself clearly under those conditions. Prepare thoroughly for every speaking opportunity, no matter how small. Preparation is the antidote to anxiety and the foundation of confidence. Know your content so well that you could discuss it conversationally with a friend. Organize your thoughts logically so your audience can follow your reasoning easily. Practice your opening and closing until they become automatic, eliminating the uncertainty that creates nervousness during those crucial moments. Master your physical presence systematically. Stand tall, breathe deeply, and use purposeful gestures that support your message. Practice in front of a mirror until confident posture and movement become natural. Remember that your body language speaks before you open your mouth. Make sure it's telling the story of someone who believes in their message and cares about their audience. Develop your voice as the powerful instrument it can become. Practice proper breathing, clear articulation, and vocal variety that keeps audiences engaged. Record yourself speaking and listen objectively to identify areas for improvement. Your voice should convey conviction, warmth, and authority, qualities that can be developed through conscious practice and attention. Asterisk. Build a collection of personal stories that illustrate important points and create emotional connection with audiences. These narratives should come from your own experience and demonstrate principles you want to teach or insights you want to share. Practice telling these stories until they flow naturally and engage listeners emotionally as well as intellectually. Learn to handle nervousness as a friend rather than an enemy. Recognize that nervous energy is your body's way of preparing for peak performance. Channel that energy into enthusiasm for your message and genuine care for your audience. Develop pre-speaking routines that calm your mind and focus your attention on serving rather than performing. Seek feedback actively and receive it gracefully. After every speaking experience, ask trusted friends or colleagues for specific observations about what worked well and what could be improved. Listen to their input without defensiveness and use it to refine your approach for next time. Remember that every accomplished speaker has made countless mistakes during their development. Errors are tuition payments in the school of confident communication. Practice the art of authentic expression by being genuinely yourself rather than trying to imitate other speakers. Your unique perspective, personality, and style are assets, not liabilities. Audiences connect with authenticity far more than they connect with perfection. Let your real personality shine through your speaking rather than hiding behind an artificial persona. Study great speakers, but don't try to copy them exactly. Instead, identify specific techniques they use effectively and adapt those techniques to fit your own style and personality. Learn from their preparation methods, their audience engagement strategies, and their handling of challenging situations, but always filter these lessons through your own authentic voice. Join or create a supportive environment where you can practice regularly with others who share your commitment to improvement. This might be a formal organization like Toastmasters, an informal group of colleagues who meet regularly to practice presentations, or even a family circle where everyone takes turns sharing insights and experiences. Handle hostile or challenging audiences by focusing on understanding their concerns rather than defending your position. When people resist your message, become curious about their perspective rather than argumentative about your own. Often, the most resistant audience members become your strongest supporters once they feel heard and respected. Develop your expertise systematically in subjects you care about deeply. Genuine knowledge and sincere passion are the best foundations for confident speaking. When you know your subject thoroughly and care about it genuinely, your confidence flows naturally from your competence and conviction. Set progressive goals that challenge you appropriately without overwhelming you. Start with small audiences and familiar topics, then gradually increase the size of your audiences and the complexity of your subjects. Each successful experience builds confidence that makes the next challenge feel more manageable. Practice recovering gracefully from mistakes rather than trying to avoid them entirely. When you stumble over words, lose your train of thought, or face unexpected challenges, handle these situations with humor, honesty, and quick refocus on your main message. Audiences appreciate speakers who demonstrate grace under pressure. Most importantly, remember that your voice matters. Your experiences, insights, and perspectives are unique and valuable. The world needs what you have to offer, but it can only benefit from your contributions if you find the courage to share them. Every time you speak confidently, you not only advance your own goals, but also give others permission to find their own voices. The journey to confident speaking is not a destination, but a process of continuous growth and development. There will be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt, but if you commit to steady progress, supportive practice, and service to others, you will discover capabilities within yourself that you never knew existed. Your transformation begins now with your very next opportunity to speak. Whether it's a comment in a meeting, a conversation with a neighbor, or a formal presentation to colleagues, approach it with the principles I've shared, and the confidence that growth is always possible. The stammering farm boy who once hid behind His mother's skirts could never have imagined the life of influence and impact that awaited him. Your own journey of transformation may take you to places you cannot yet envision. The only way to discover your true potential is to begin where you are. Use what you have and do what you can. The world is waiting to hear your voice. Make sure it's confident, authentic, and ready to make a difference.